August the 1st, 1990, I retired from IBM at age 60. IBM's policy at that time was that officers of the corporation would retire at age 60. This was done so that fresh blood could move up. A high-tech company needed to have young blood, and by making it worthwhile for us to retire at 60, we felt it invigorated the firm. I happen to agree with that, incidentally. I think it was a great idea. They assigned you or offered you a choice of several financial advisors about 15 years before you retired, and they helped you plan for future retirement from the standpoint of finances. During that period, about 8 years before I retired, I was reading a book on the Russian Revolution one Sunday night, and I kept thinking about all those people in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, that lost their fortunes after the communist takeover because all of their money was in one spot. And I called my advisor the following day and said, you know, we need to do something to diversify. I have so much IBM stock, but I don't have much else. And if we don't diversify, I could run into a trouble the way those people did in Russia. And so he and I set out a plan that worked out very well. So that's about all I'm going to say about retirement, except that I got an awful lot of nice letters and presents when I retired. But one of the ones that I'm most proud of is a beautiful pre-IBM clock made by the International Time Recording Company. This was one of the original companies that was merged to form IBM. And this clock, which was one of the first business machines because it recorded when you came in and when you went out, is hanging on the wall in my condo, and was given to me by the chairman of the board of IBM, John Akers, who got it from the IBM Museum for me. Now, we're going to talk about several phases of post-retirement life. First phase was looking in on my mother. The second was, of course, enjoying children and grandchildren. The third are the boards and committees I worked on, some very, very interesting and invigorating boards. I'm going to also talk about travel. Been a lot of travel. I took over 40 significant trips since retirement. And then last, we talk about my hobbies and collections. And the reason I'm going into this is that I think everybody needs to have fulfilling things to do when they retire. And this perhaps will give you a stimulation to think ahead, even down to the grandchildren, of what you will be doing someday when your professional life is over. My mother lived to be 110 years old and 7 months. And you notice I didn't say look after my mother, I said look in on my mother, because she lived 21 years after I retired, 21 years. And there was a lot of, as they say, schlepping back and forth between Washington, D.C. and Phoenix, because she lived in Sun City outside Phoenix. Now, many people visited. Jack and Waldine visited many times. Linda did a tremendous job, particularly the last 10 years, in looking after Mother, making many, many, many trips up and winning over all the major people at her retirement place and making life better for Mother. And also Alice Davis, one of the residents there at her retirement home, Royal Oaks. Alice Davis was of tremendous help, tremendous help. We had birthday parties, and we had more birthday parties and celebrations, and I think Mother lived a very, very happy life. As far as the children and grandchildren concerned, towards the end of my IBM career and beginning retirement, Charlie and Linda did various things. Linda got her master's degree from Catholic U and proceeded to practice as a certified social worker. She eventually met Charles DeConcini, and they moved to Tucson, Arizona, where they spent time between Tucson and the ranch that they bought in the Sonora state of Mexico itself. And Linda's thoroughly enjoyed the work of the ranch and the development of that ranch, as well as her many, many, many other activities. But there'll be time to talk more about the children at another stage. Charlie was involved in a boutique photography business in Los Angeles. He went on to get his master's degree at Babson, just outside Boston, and then went with Ogilvy and Mather in the advertising business and moved from there to Mother. He meanwhile married Anna Gasteyer, who he had known at Sidwell Friends and met in San Francisco. And some 12 years after I retired, the first grandchild came. And so I had to have some things to do other than grandchildren at that point. And Francis was born at that particular point, and then Ulysses came 5 or 6 years later. And so it's always been a pleasure. It was great to have the grandchildren come down and visit the old house on 4929 Rockwood Parkway. We had scavenger hunts. We had Easter there. We had Christmas there. And it was a pleasure to be up there in Dumbo and also to be out at their home on Fire Island. Life also requires a lot more activity. And I want to talk to you about a few boards that I was on. These were nonprofit boards for the most part. And they kept me very, very, very busy the first 10 or 15 years after I retired. The first was the board of the Washington Hospital Center. This is the largest tertiary care hospital in the Washington area, had 800 beds. And being on its board was a challenge because hospitals were facing, as you know, in the last 20, 30 years, massive change in procedures, in cost distribution, in management, and in their patient population. But it was not only a hospital board. This was very unusual. In the Washington Hospital Center owned 1 or 2 other hospitals, and then they formed what was Medlantic, which then bought more hospitals, which then morphed into what now is called MedStar, which is one of the largest care providers on the East Coast, having 20 hospitals now. And so being involved in this on executive committee and chairman of different committees during this time was very intellectually stimulating. There was a lot of hard work. Sometimes I was out there at the hospital 2 or 3 times a week, but watching this evolve was a great challenge. I also joined the board of my national fraternity, Lambda Chi Alpha. We're a very large fraternity. We have over 120 local chapters of undergraduates and tens of thousands of graduates. And as you know, a lot is changing in the fraternity world in coping with diversity, in coping with hazing, coping with alcoholism, the changes in the family. And to sit on that board was quite invigorating. You know, we're faced with those people who wanted things to be just like they were 20, 30 years ago, and those of us who said, look, the fraternities have to change if they're going to exist. It was also on the fraternity's educational foundation, where we raised money to help put on educational programs on leadership for the undergraduates. And I also incidentally helped start the foundation at the Washington Hospital Center and served on that board. So these things were very, very invigorating. There are others that I won't bother you with, but I found that kind of activity, meeting new people, learning how other businesses operate, and focusing on some of the changes going on in society was a great deal of fun. Now let's talk about travel for a minute. Always liked travel. You may remember first trip I ever took was in the 50s, went to Mexico. And you may recall earlier we talked about the trip around the world to India and Egypt and places like that. So travel is good because it gets you away from home, new experiences. It could be very educational. And I have always used good tour guides. I've always read ahead before the trip. We've always have a very active travel schedule. Just in this recent trip to Israel, which we'll get to later, we were in Israel about 22 days, and we literally toured every day from 8 to 5, except for one day, and that day we went out on our own. So we learned a lot. I learned a lot by traveling, and traveling with my friend Charlotte Klein. Also, we've had some fabulous trips. I'm going to talk about a few of the really interesting ones. And I can go on for hours. So don't worry, I'm not going to do it. But I could go on for hours on the subject of travel. One of the most interesting, of course, was crossing Siberia about 1992 with my son Charlie. We flew to Sakhalin Island first, then flew over to Vladivostok and took the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow. This was a train we had rented. We were with the Stanford University group, and we had rented the train, so the train would stop in a town, we'd get out, visit the town, get back, have dinner perhaps in town, get back on the train, and head out. And you know, this is, I think, 11 time zones across Siberia. Fantastic trip. Another trip later on was a bike trip from Munich to Vienna. A friend from Duke called and said, my wife and I were taking this trip, but she's canceled out. Would you like to go? And we did. We met, hadn't seen him in over 20 years. And it was a fabulous trip along the Danube, seeing Austria very up close, all the sights, and ending up in Vienna. Also a very interesting trip to Spain, covering Spanish Civil War sites, because as you recall, Spanish Civil War was one of my great interests. I met Charlotte Klein, and Charlotte and I started traveling, and Charlotte and I have had over 30 significant foreign trips. And by significant, I mean, you know, where we had an agenda, we had tour guides, and we were learning things. The first one that we took together was we took the train from London, the Oriental Express, to Venice, Italy. And it was black tie for dinner. We got to Venice and then toured Venice and had a great time. She'd been there many times. We also have taken a private jet trip. You read about those, where maybe 18 people get together and the tour company has rented a private jet and you fly to 8 or 9 different countries. And that was fun. We did that about 2000. We went to Iran, we went to Syria, Jordan, Burma, we were in Cambodia, Angkor Wat, went on to Mongolia, to Western China. It was a fabulous trip, fabulous trip. One very interesting trip fairly recently was a trip to Iceland. And if you've never been to Iceland, it's a very exciting place. And then on to Ireland. I had been reading James Joyce because on my 80th birthday, I read James Joyce's Ulysses as a challenge. And I'd been reading William Butler Yeats, the great Irish poet who was also a Nobel Prize winner. And so Charlotte and I had a car and a driver, and we went from Dublin up into Northern Ireland and then over to the west coast of Ireland and then down around the coast and back to Dublin. We circumnavigated the Irish island. And we matched it because, for instance, the opening scenes of the famous book Ulysses takes place in a Napoleon-era tower, fortress tower, just outside Dublin. And we went out there, and sure enough, to visit the tower, they were actually putting on the first part of the book Ulysses and performing it right under our own eyes. We also visited the, on the western part of Ireland, things from William Butler Yeats. We went out and visited the Isle of Innisfree, the famous Isle of Innisfree. We went to Galway. We went to some of the great Irish homes. Had a wonderful, wonderful time tied in to our literature study. We also had a very, very interesting experience, and that is we were on a cruise ship going around Alaska. And this was not the regular cruise ship down at the bottom of Alaska. We went up into the Arctic Sea, visited all the Eskimo islands, St. Lawrence and these islands, King Island. We also went over to Siberia for a brief visit because those people are closely related to the Inuit people in that part of Alaska. And then on the way back, we were in the Aleutian Islands, and one Saturday night we had a shipwreck. Shipwreck, I should say. We hit rocks and had to abandon ship. And Charlotte and I abandoned the ship. We were third or fourth people to get off because they let the older people go first, or the people with grandchildren to go first. And we were in a little rubber Zodiac with an engine heading out into the Bering Sea. But remember, it's August and there's a lot of light until 11 or 12 o'clock in Alaska. And we finally were picked up by a Russian trawler, fish trawler, that was headed for Hamburg, Germany. And that trawler took us back to Unalaska, where we had been visiting earlier in the day, and we eventually got home. Nobody was harmed. We got our luggage, but it was an exciting thing for a couple. Exciting thing. Another very, very exciting trip, and I recommend it to everybody, is to go up into northern Manitoba in Canada, almost at the Arctic Circle, and that's where the polar bears are. And we went out into the tundra in these big vans with gigantic wheels and went right to where the polar bears, and they walk by, they peek in your window, and you can watch them eat and play with their little children. That was a really, really fun trip, and recommend it strongly. And then, of course, our latest trip, the trip I referred to earlier to Israel, which was earlier this year in 2019, and in which we had rented a car and a guide, and we started in Jerusalem, and we covered the entire country, with the exception of the port of Eilat. We didn't go there, but visited Jerusalem and all the historical sites, as well as the holy sites, the Dead Sea area, up to the Sea of Galilee, the Golan Heights, and over to the Mediterranean, to Haifa, down to Tel Aviv. Of course, we stayed in Tel Aviv, we stayed in the Galilee. And then after we did those areas, we went down to Gaza and then down into the Negev desert, to a beautiful resort deep, deep into the Negev, not far from the Egyptian border. And that was fabulous because there's so many civilizations. You have all the biblical times, you have the Roman times, you have the Byzantine, you have the Crusader times, you have the Muslim, the Turks, the British, and then the independent nation of Israel and all the exciting things they've done. And that was very, very exciting. Travel can be very good, but you need to plan it. You need to have good tour guides. You need to read, and also be as comfortable as you can on the trip. Now, at this point, I'd like to talk to you about my hobbies and my collecting habits. Now, some people carry collecting to an extreme, and I could be one of those. I'm not sure, but we'll let you judge that over time. But I've always felt that collecting was more than just having a lot of stuff. Collecting is, finding interesting, beautiful things, being interested in them, researching them, learning about them, learning about the artist, learning about the style, learning about materials. It's intellectually absorbing. You meet other people that are interested. Now, of course, one of my collections is on the Spanish Civil War. And I'm not going to dwell on that here because I've made a separate video just telling about the Spanish Civil War collection. And that is one of the largest in the country. And it's something really worth taking a look at that video, if you would. And I think you'll find it very, very enjoyable. But one of the things that has absorbed me the most in the last 15 years is collecting tools and items of everyday life of Native Americans, especially Southwestern Native Americans and Inuit in both Alaska and Canada. And these items I have organized, and they're in special cabinets, sometimes on the shelf. But it's interesting to note that something like Eskimo artifacts, which is a big portion of my collection. Now here's just one book right here on a certain type of Eskimo, over 500 pages of artifacts. Here's another very, very interesting book called Eskimo Artifacts Designed for Use, because that's what my collection is. Things they used in everyday life. Scraping snow, making an igloo, cooking dinner, hunting, fishing, whatever they're going to do. Now, the collection is also backed up by a library. And we have a picture here of the library books that tell about the various segments of life of these people and their daily living and the tools they used. In addition to that, every item in the collection is in one of about 7 3-ring binders, such as this, in which each item is written up, pictures shown of the item, and then I fill in as much detail as I possibly can over time by hand, because I can then add to it, and I build up a record of what it's about, how it was used, and where and what museums it might be shown in, and it makes it very exciting to do that. So this isn't just accumulating objects, it's learning about them, keeping a record on them, and learn more about them all the time. Second collection grouping that I have are different book collections. We mentioned Spanish Civil War, but I also have a collection of colonial American and early republic books. Books on the colonies, the forming of the democracy, the writing of the Constitution, and in the early formative years of the American Union. We have also a collection of political cartoons, and about 30 of them are on the wall in my second bedroom in this condominium and in a few other rooms. 30 are framed and on the wall. And then in addition, on the bookshelves, we have several dozen books on cartoons going back to Gil Ray in the English days in the early 1700s. We have a collection of over 1,500 Thomas Nast cartoons that somebody somewhere cut out of the paper and pasted into scrapbooks. And we have 8 of those and a lot of others. Political cartoons that show the relevance. If you look at the ones on the wall, the issues they're talking about are some of the same issues that we're talking about right now. And these on the wall were dated around the year 1900. Another interesting thing about collecting is that you find people who share your interest in collecting, and you develop relationships and information sources. My friend Charlotte Klein not only has accompanied me on travel for the last 25 years, but also collects Alaskan and Canadian art. And we're going to take a look at her collection, but I just want to tell you ahead of time, she has one of the finest collection of baleen baskets in the United States. These are baskets that are made out of a fiber that comes from the mouth of a whale, and are carefully woven by Alaskans in the very north, and then have beautiful carved ivory finials on top of the basket. She also has some beautiful Bering Sea Eskimo, Inuit, Upiaq masks, as well as beautiful pottery with Alaskan and Canadian motif and a wide variety of artifacts. So I collect the tools, she collects the art, and so on our various trips, we have something in common to also look for and buy and share. Well, look, we've talked an awful lot about these things for the last few minutes, but I think the important thing is that once you retire and leave your professional life, there are many, many exciting things that you can do and also be learning at the same time. Let me just end by saying that 3 years ago, this very month, I sold the family house at 4929 Rockwood Parkway in the District of Columbia and moved to Fox Hill, a condominium in Fox Hill, a senior living facility on River Road. And it was one of the best moves I've ever made. I've thoroughly enjoyed living here and the vigor of meeting all the many, many interesting people here. So I hope these stories of my life, both from lessons learned and exciting retirement, will be of interest and of value to you.